The year was 1844 when the first messages came through the telegraph of, "What hath God wrought?" This message had a kind of important meaning. At the time, this message indicated also one of the first uses of what we're going to consider as lossless compression. The message, in which how they had to transmit at the time, had to transmit different characters, beeps and pauses. But when they're doing that, they want to make sure it could be compressed with Morse code so that the time duration to exchange a message could be done in a timely way and in an efficient manner, because it took time, of course, to transmit these messages. When designing Morse code, there was a concept of this lossless compression, which means exchanging data without loss by having both the sender and the receiver having a known code to reference. And therefore, they could use a smaller amount of data to transmit highly frequently used characters. So you can see here the E, T, A, O, I, and N are being transmitted at a smaller amount to do it. And this was kind of references one of the first times of using lossless compression. This is important because as we start exchanging ideas and communicating more, it was important to look at how we can do it in the most efficient manner. Later, we've also been trying to transmit kind of different things of what we have ideas in our mind. And in that transmission, we've oftentimes have found ways to compress that type of data. So in this picture here where we have this fire-breathing unicorn, there's means now of doing lossy compression, which means you can compress this type of picture down, but there is data loss. So you can see if I wanted to kind of convert this down to a certain level, I could take it from a 373 kilobyte quality type image down to 43. You can see it kind of doesn't look the same. It also is a little fuzzy, so if you kind of get down to certain details or specifics, it doesn't really match what you expect. But from the high level, you still have a good idea of what I was trying to articulate. So I often feel like these two cases, when you think about exchanging information, and we just use the examples of lossless and lossy type compression, it highlights this kind of also data loss and based off how much we have to transmit to make sure the other person comprehends what we're sharing. And this is a big part of this type of data because it is an element of how we have using words. Words are a key means of how we exchange things through our language. And in our language, we often have to kind of express things to try to articulate an idea in our mind, but it's, to me, often a form of lossy data transmission. When we try to use the words in our language to share something, like earlier with my fire-breathing unicorn, the other person may have a different type of picture in their mind based off how I'm describing it. And this is a very hard challenge because in our world where we're dealing with more and more complex things, we're trying to use language that we know it through words. And when we do that type of exchange, we're trying to get the other person to have a pretty clear understanding of what that means. And so therefore, words kind of often fall into my mind of this lossy compression challenge where we're trying to be concise, but there's a lot of times information lost because it isn't always fully comprehended. There isn't the same key lookup on the other side to know exactly what I mean and what does that illustrate in their mind. This kind of gets further highlighted in our technology world with the use of acronyms. Acronyms are very popular where we exchange type of ideas and compress them down because they have either are a very long word or there's something we kind of know and we don't like to fully say it every time, so it's easier to build an acronym to reference it. And hence, in our world of ever-changing and growing things with technology, there are lots of acronyms. Here's just a few examples of where we have common acronyms that are also paired with numbers as the abbreviation of characters. This is many times these words when we exchange ideas are usually in the written form, but though sometimes they're actually said in the verbal form, which can even cause more confusion. Whereas Kubernetes, where you could have this K8S, sometimes it's pronounced as Kates. Some people say that, but then other people may not know what that means at all. Or observability, where it's O11Y, but it's pronounced Ollie. And even internationalization, which I hear often, where they'll say IETN type concerns. And so that can also get lost where if someone doesn't know what that means the first time, they can be quite confused. but it's used as a means of abbreviation, and that is also a kind of a lossy data transmission unless the receiver has that key code. So in this talk, this is words matter. And in that kind of intro, I was trying to share a little bit of our analogical type thinking against how we look at compression, lossless and lossy type compression, and how words are often hard because we lose data sometimes in exchanging ideas to others. And we know words matter, especially when it gets down to technical details of things we're trying to share. So the goal here is to say, how can we get better at speaking to others, because there's a wide range of understanding. And there's good context that sometimes has to be shared, but you want to be efficient. And so what is that compression? What's the right level of data you have to exchange with someone else by explaining something so they also can understand it? I feel like this example often gets highlighted when you're first talking with someone or you're with a family event and they want to know what do you do? Like, what would you say you do here? And when they usually ask that question, they're usually saying, we know you work with computers. Can you explain to like your relatives, what do you do with computers? And sometimes it's kind of hard because you realize there's a lot of things, if you were to first explain it, it require additional things to be explained. How can you describe something so that a general audience can know about it, but also that you don't get too much into the weeds to where you kind of drag them into more things that might be harder to understand. So this is I think a common example that we often feel the importance of words in describing something, but then knowing your audience. The audience is a big challenge. And in our technical field, when you're working through these topics, you'll find that you'll have different types of backgrounds and disciplines that care about different things. And that care is what a lot of times you want to focus on so that you understand the messaging you give seems somewhat personalized or resonates well with them, but you realize different things may need to be highlighted with different types of background context. So you don't want to explain the most basic fundamental things every time to more of an expert audience. Same kind of goes true where you don't want to like breeze over something and introduce a very complex topic when someone may not understand it. So how best can you do this and understand your audience, communicate your ideas efficiently, and get them to where you actually can know what some of these things that you actually do without making it too complicated at first? I think often when we talk about these, we deal with a lot of abstractions in our technology world. It helps us in quite a bit of where we take a complex problem and we put a scene over top of it. And we try to describe what is within that abstraction, that kind of conceptual boundary. But that itself, that concept, that abstraction is complex. To bring it up, to kind of expose that, you have to start explaining other parts about that abstraction. So you realize there's an actual cost if you were to bring something up. A common joke is if you were in a conversation and you share a concept like Kubernetes, as Rob earlier, you usually have to explain more things about that than just that alone. You just say, well, this is where we kind of run our container workloads. That may not actually fully answer it, though it could help others understand parts of what the problem is and why it's being used. But here's two things I thought was pretty helpful. Ann Janzer has this kind of, in an interview, help kind of articulate whenever there's a cost to including an abstraction concept in something you're describing, you want to think about two things. One, is it familiar already to the audience? That might seem kind of obvious, but you should really think about it. If you're depending on the meeting or who you're with, first think about it. If they do not already know this, you're probably going to have to introduce it. If you introduce it, that's going to be more cost to unfold the other parts about that system, at least to some high level. The other part is it actually necessary to reference it. Many times I find it isn't. You can share quite a bit about the things about the problem without opening up other problems of these abstractions that they're even holding. They're these other subsystems of your bigger system picture. So consider these when you're bringing up things, because you can kind of introduce a lot of complexity in a conversation if you start bringing up abstractions of these high-level concepts, because we deal with many of them. You have to think about it. Would the audience actually know what this is? And think about it based off who you already know is in this group. If you don't know who's in this group, you probably can't even fully answer that yet until we start talking through how you identify some of that. The second part about it is it actually necessary to use? And sometimes I think you can find it's kind of enlightening that you don't always have to be bringing up all these examples. One of these terms I've found be pretty valuable is called boundary spanning, or a boundary spanner. This came up in a podcast called The Ideal Cast with Gene Kim in his interview with Michael Nygaard. And I really like this reference because it kind of talked about things that are important to navigate across different boundaries. And these boundaries, I kind of made some examples here, but you can kind of think about different type of groups or disciplines or areas of focus that you want to be able to speak to effectively in the course of the whole business. So usually you're working on something within it's of the interest of a company or your organization, and there's different groups within there, and you want to speak to all those so you can actually help change or influence what those are. And so it kind of helps to where, one, if you don't understand those areas, it's hard to speak or know those terms. Like, what do they actually care about? So a valuable thing I found first was you just need a lot of experience. You have to go and work in all these different areas and start building up that empathy and understanding what people usually perceive. But you can sometimes shortcut some of that of building up your network. Find out other people in these groups and start working with them. Find out what they really care, what they typically ask about, because they'll start articulating what are the things of interest to them. So when you were to speak to some group, you know that you probably care about some realm of that topic. So one example with development, there's a lot of times when you're sharing something that you're working through, there's a lot of things around the non-functional properties of the software that you're building. How maintainable is that? Or looking at the security posture and the changes, you could have one lens of a development security view. You could have a different realm of just a full security audience. So in that a little bit further to the right, you could then look at security audience that many times looks at risks, and you always have risk in your software in terms of security. And you're looking at this lens of minimization. So how can you reduce things all the time? Don't ever think you're just safe from anything. You're always looking for how you can reduce everything that you can possibly think of, because there's always some option that could possibly come up. So you're always saying, look, what are my risks? I have risks. I must have them. And how would I deal and minimize those exposures? From an operations standpoint, if you're bringing some of this, if I were to bring up internal, like those non-functional properties or design patterns to an operations group, they may not care as much when they're thinking about, well, I'm usually exposed to the concrete parts of the system. So I like Michael Nygaard kind of referenced this as like machine names or ports or files. And I thought it was a really good way of thinking what's usually the elements that are externalized in the runtime environment they have to deal with. And that's what they normally they're caring about, or what usually causes issues with alerts. What is the things that they have to deal with to know that this would be an important topic, or you want to share that relevant context to them? To the last part with like the business, you may be bringing up something that you usually care about of how it gets normalized to the big areas of with a strategy of both time and money. When you talk about things, if you can't normalize it to money, some type of dollar amount, sometimes it's maybe hard to reference why are we doing this. And so why it's sometimes difficult to kind of get down to that point of just dollars, realize that some people aren't so interested of these lower technical details something's built unless you can convey why it's so valuable. Meaning, are we going to save money? Are we able to go faster? What is the bigger parts of the business gets the kind of the larger value from it? So even though some of that may be interesting from a technical lens, it doesn't help you go that much faster. In this one, Gregor Hope gives a great example of what he calls the architect elevator. And in this, he kind of uses this reference where you think about that we are kind of spanning an organization. You have different layers of abstraction, even in your organization structure. And each one deals with different parts of complexity. What I liked about this is that you have to think about, you have to traverse this. And as an architect, it also implies you have a level of experience. You have things you have to speak to at different parts of those levels. Not all levels talk the same way. And you sometimes have to do like a telephone game. You'll see between different levels of that kind of building you're traversing in the elevator. What I think is important when you're looking at that, you have to recognize you have different levels and you need to speak differently. Sometimes the messaging has to be different of why we're doing it, because the same why may exist, but the way it's framed may have to be emphasized so that they understand, oh, this is how the thing that we're doing, that's why it will actually support that bigger need in the business. So the thing I also liked about is from a technical audience, how important is it always be kind of connected to the engine room, how you're doing and building things is really important to influence a lot of that of what you have to re-communicate up at different levels. Or they're always generally wanting people to communicate at these different levels so everyone can understand. When you have information loss in that telephone game between levels, that's usually a big point of frustration. But you also have to understand that's because the same message being used at the engine room cannot be used at a different level because it may not make sense because of that audience. So think about this. And I would highly recommend listening to his talk on the architect elevator because I think it highlights that very much need of recognizing these different levels require different forms of communication, but also the importance of being able to traverse those in your points of communicating. One thing I found was fairly interesting of trying to understand your audience. It's very difficult to get everyone's like deep understanding. You're not going to do a bunch of analytics for every meeting to figure out how best to convey a message. But it can happen through practice on one-on-one conversations with different people. So we talked about the boundary spanning. If you were to kind of start building your network in different groups, you can test your idea from people in those intentional different groups to find out how they perceive or what they find valuable or not valuable. And you start looking at focusing on your messaging in that realm. Another way I found is helpful is when I've taught like a workshop type setting before where you'd have 20 to 30 people in there. You can't really have a lot of good analytics on who's in there and have already networked between different groups to have a good understanding before it happens. So often there's like an icebreaker in a large meeting before you started or a workshop of who are you and what do you work on. I like to keep it where the first one of the primary questions of that is like what do you want to get out of this class? What's the one thing you want to get out of this when you're trying to share some new idea or concept? And when you force that little bit of that prioritization to someone else and saying, tell me what's the one of the most important things you want to get out of it, people generally do a good job of sharing what it is, but you can see sometimes they have to think about, well, what is my one thing? Because there's maybe multiple. If you find that when they share it, many times their question gives good context of what they already know. So when they're kind of going of like, I'm just trying to learn at a high level what this even means, like, okay, that's good. We'll keep focusing on the high level, general concepts. But then you'll find other groups that the question will be very pointed on a specific area, and it helps to kind of capture that. Doing that in that larger group, I found it really helpful when they bring these up. You just inventory them on the wall of the audience and saying, oh, here it is, and you're kind of building it, and you're saying, after this workshop, we will answer all these to some degree. It gives that kind of also that interest that the audience has of trying to listen in, because you're going to say, I'm going to help answer all the ones that you have, because I will focus on those as we go through the topic. You've already told me what I need to go after as your one primary one. If people want to give you more than one thing to go after, you can say, no, you only get one. That can be a joke, of course, but it's good to make sure you're focusing on one because you let them really dig in. And then, of course, as you categorize it from multiple people, you may say, oh, this one is what everyone wants. You've all said this, and I don't have many on my list because there's only a few. So it's a good way to really quickly learn an audience when you're in a big setting. You don't have a good understanding of everyone's involved first before you start sharing a technical idea either you're teaching on, trying to inform or influence a bigger idea. An important part of this is as we start learning about our audience is how to start communicating things that can work well in a broad sense. And so in using technical things, when you start describing things and using just only other technical relevant terms, that can be a hard thing to actually get out and shared to a larger audience because, again, it requires more context. Remember, each abstraction you share, you have to unfold more of those, and that could cause a lot of things you keep explaining. A very powerful thought is using these, listing as a universal metaphor, but metaphors or analogies that you make a reference of something is like this. That is very powerful. I think one of the biggest pieces of this is when you think about all these things we deal with in software and technology today, they have a very basic, like a desktop and a file and folder structures. That type of concept is really valuable because people are all familiar with those types of things. And so when you start using these very basic concepts, people connect with what that means to them. It may have a little bit of a specialized meaning, but it's pretty general. Everyone has a good understanding of what that is. And so you don't want to use a really complicated metaphor. I've used metaphors in the past and found that I got a lot of questions from it. I was like, ooh, that was probably a bad metaphor because I actually had to teach people what the metaphor meant. And so you want to be careful. When you share metaphors, it can really quickly connect people on a topic. And that's just to kind of get them first informed of what it is. And they all kind of resonate with it. But also be mindful, this is a magical ability of doing kind of metaphors or analogies. So you can use bad metaphors and bad analogies that can bring things that you don't want into the topic, such as like bad negative thoughts or emotions about something when you don't want it to be a bad negative emotional part of it. I found it funny in older types of system diagrams, every once in a while they'd show the sausage making horn So like when you're making sausages, and in that illustration, it was like the magical unit where things would come in and then something would come out. Well, if you use a sausage form, some people may not be interested in eating meat. Some people who've seen how sausage is made don't like it. And some people who are sausage makers actually like it and are upset when people make comparisons that sausage making is a gross type activity. So when you bring up sausage making, sometimes people get confused, like, what is that actually, like, why did you have to bring that up? Because some people have different feelings about sausages and making that process. So be mindful about that. When you share a metaphor or analogy, make sure it's a good one. Like the one I gave there kind of mixed feelings. There's even articles out there when people have compared sausage making to lawmaking and how people may like the result, but they don't like the process. Well, you see articles of sausage makers saying, I don't like that reference. It's not a good one. So just be mindful. Use simple ones when you try to share your ideas. The power of visualization is a good one on thinking through when you verbally describe something. You want people to build that visual in their mind, and a visual can really help connect them faster to something. And so there's an element of visual persuasion is really important. So if you're trying to convince someone about something, you want things to be much more visual in their mind, especially if you're trying to magnify an important piece of this. Visual type things they're often referenced in external marketing you may get exposed to, or political ads, where they always try to focus on a lot of imagery. But when you're trying to describe something, think about the words that you're using and what kind of image or sensories get kind of activated when you use it. I use this kind of very simple example, but if you're trying to, if there's something that you're really worrying about or some issue, I've heard several times that there's a hidden defect or defects may arise from this. Sometimes it doesn't actually sound as scary as what you may be feeling, versus you say there's like a lurking defect, like this defect is like ready to ambush us. And so sometimes when you use a language like that, you can think, well, whoa, this is actually, there's something like bad about that defect. And that's sometimes an important part when you describe technical topics. You also be good to use kind of words that build a visual in their mind. If something's big, you may say it's like towering over something else. That builds that visual in their mind, and it helps connect them faster of the importance of something you may want to bring up. Clear and concise language is important, but it's not easy, especially when you're trying to be very specific without sharing too many details. And I think the big challenge with this element of being concise is that our use of abstractions. And if you use an abstraction, it therefore encourages you to bring up other things, and you may not want to bring up those other things. So be mindful of when you share different types of abstractions or topics like that, if you're trying to be concise, that could be actually a dangerous element. So you may have to actually warm up the idea before you start talking more into abstraction. Being concise is great. You don't want to just keep talking about lots of things or use lots of filler words. But you also want to be mindful that it can actually be costly to try to be concise if you use complex abstractions. I like to always remind people of the importance of decoding things when you first bring it up. So if I were to talk about something with Kubernetes, keep using that example, but that is something you probably want to decode when you're giving to a very large general audience. And it's hard sometimes when you're presenting a technical topic, you may think, okay, everyone should know this by now. But depending on what you're planning to do, if it's supposed to be for a general audience, you probably have to still warm up a little bit, just at a high level of what it means or why are you sharing it, why is it important to you? And remember, you can use metaphors as simple things to also try to connect on those topics. So when you bring it up, realize that you probably should think about what would be a good way of decoding this for the first time you bring it up. Because then you can make it a habit of how you decode it the first time you bring it up into a large group. You don't, of course, don't have to keep doing that when you know the people in the group every time you talk about it. But most people are also not bored when you have a very brief decoding at the beginning of describing something. So like, okay, we're going to be talking about objectives and key results or OKRs. You bring that up first, not too many people say, well, why do you keep spelling it out? Well, I only do it once when I bring it up. But if you just said OKRs, some people who aren't familiar with the concept, they say, what is this? Like, I don't even know what we're talking about yet. So make sure you understand and get a practice of saying that when you first have a bigger audience, try to decode things in a simple way first, just so you don't cause a mishap and you have a lot of people who are kind of waiting and like, I think I'm supposed to know this, but I don't. Remember, most people aren't offended if you decode things. An important part about this too is when we talked about that sea of abstraction, all these generalities that exist. It's hard when you talk about those because sometimes it's the audience can get disconnected of how they can apply it or understand it. So when we talk about, let's say, a lot of different types of ways we're building a search platform, you might be trying to bring this up because there's an issue with how we're approaching search today. And when everyone starts talking about that topic, they keep thinking about this very generic thing, but they don't know how it fits into the system. It's helpful to first bring up an actual concrete case. So we say in the search 1.1 release, this is why it's not working and why we should be building a better search platform. Use something as a concrete case because you can talk about it. You can give specific examples or recent events, things that seem applicable, but it's a talking point to actually test ideas to a real thing. So concepts are always important to think about, how you may make a more generic or general way of describing something, but realize people can also get lost in that sea. You want that concrete example as a talking piece. It helps anchor the discussion. And so when something else comes up and they're questioning it, let's go back to that concrete example and test it against that. How did that not work in the search 1.1 problem? And then you can talk through it and find out, it only suffered from this one problem of how we have to manage our search index. So you can have a better way of relating topics as you talk through it so you don't stay too stuck in the abstract for long. One of the other parts I thought was really good from Gregor Hope was his reference on when you look at system pictures or things you're trying to describe to others. A lot of times he kind of mentions the required things of every architecture type diagram is boxes and arrows, but it has to have arrows. If it doesn't have an arrow, meaning a relationship to something else, it doesn't actually map to it. And so an important piece of this is that you have to be talking about a bigger system and the value that comes from it. And in this case, if you just were to use this reference of a meal, so when you talk about, again, a comparison to something else that many people can relate to, and they say, when you go to a restaurant, you're not picking just the ingredients. You're looking at a meal, something of value, something that people want. You're not looking at picking at individual type parts with it. And that's really valuable because I've seen this come up often when we talk about systems, and they talk about just like the technology slice pieces of it. And that technology item isn't actually that clear. Each part of it is just like one little attribute or aspect in their system, but it doesn't describe much at all. If you told me you had a bunch of Go routines or a Java process running or something that kind of helps understand what technology you may be considering to use or your ecosystem. It doesn't tell me much about your system though. Like what is it calling or what else does it need or why did you build that? So the ingredients often get referred to because it's the technology we like or are interested in, but it doesn't really tell me much about your system, the value, the bigger thing, the meal that you enjoy and what you want to pick through. The other part about this is actually how do you improve kind of sharing all these ideas. And so one thing I found was really helpful was when we talk about a lot of times these words that matter and explaining ideas, is that it takes practice, as with lots of things, but writing helps you kind of do a lot of refinement. And then when I've listened to how other authors have, when they write books or try to make, they write something and then they rewrite it and they rewrite it. And they use that kind of writing form to have a lot of different kind of diffs. If you're thinking about writing a different optimized way in your code, if you're writing something out, you can look at it, you can take it apart, try it in a different way, try it again. Writing is a great way of practicing how you frame something. And I think it's also really great if you're trying to make a concise, simple way of introducing yourself. So if you are trying to explain more concepts and you're kind of feel like you're struggling each time, practice writing and what that is, and then practice saying that each time. So then you get in the habit of sharing that same kind of story as an introduction, and you find that's a better way of describing something. But remember, writing is a great way of doing it. If you're not, and if you, depending on your writing interests, I often tell people to practice trying to do blogging on their own because it helps do that. It helps try to articulate your thought for someone else to digest, even if no one else is doing it just yet, because it helps your own process of sharing an idea, explaining why you thought in a certain way. An important piece of all these is when you're sharing a lot of these topics, you can often get into different areas, especially when it's very technical, where one topic comes up midway through the thing you're describing, and they want to get in details into that. And you can get deep into something else and talk quite a bit, and you miss the general understanding of what you're trying to get to. And people often start getting disconnected from listening because they're like, I'm having a hard time understanding even the point of this. Like, why does this matter? And you're like, well, the point of this was to help improve how we communicate to others. So I'm trying to summarize and share these points of how to better know your audience or better communicate in using metaphors. And so if you have something you use as a summarization means, you want to bring that up kind of early. Why are we talking about this? And you can also always bring it up at the end. So kind of that start to end, and use it as a connection point throughout. So this kind of TLDL, or too long didn't listen, is an important part because often people aren't able to listen the whole time, or they have a lot of distractions. So remember that, having something at the beginning, but you can use it as an anchor point of why we're talking about something at each step of the way. An important piece of this too that I find is storytelling with the user. So storytelling, as you've probably heard from others, I always feel like we always are told how important storytelling is of conveying ideas. People love to listen to stories. Sometimes it's hard to tell a story when you're talking about like a low-level technical thing of a system. But what I find is usually helpful is that you can normally try to think through what's the user experience. And sometimes you're like, well, I don't know who would use this because this is, again, some service that is in the background running and handling all these requests. Or who's creating these requests? Or what's the consuming application? Or what's the bigger system that imposes this? And so the interesting part of this is that, one, it helps you start understanding that context better of why the thing you're sharing is important to someone else, because you have to know what's the impact, who uses this, why is it important. The other part about it too is that this is a great way of normalizing the understanding to others. If you talk it from an end user perspective, it usually helps you fold back some of these really technical things that you didn't have to bring up. Remember, we talked about some abstractions you don't always need to bring up. When you try to peel it back, you're actually starting to understand, like, oh, if we improve this, it actually will improve the response time of logins by 1 second because this, all these other reasons. But then people are like, oh, that's really important. That's a great summarization of why I care about this. And this is also a way of how you better understand your impact when you work through it. Something I've done in the past, which I thought was also helpful, was, remember we mentioned visualizations are really important. As you describe things, you want people to connect with what you're describing to the actual impact, like they have a tie to this visual persuasion of what it means. Is that you can actually kind of like record. So if you have something that's in my case, it was like actual like a web app and a console, was trying to do something where they're installing an application and spinning up and trying it. There's a long time they had to go through an earlier process to do that. And we said, we definitely need to optimize that, but let's take the best person or most informed kind of subject matter expert to do that task and time it. Let's do a screen recording, you just do it. And so you can watch what they're doing. You see like, oh, this is how they normally flow, or how much time certain tasks take that don't even make sense because it's might be an infrastructure problem. And then the other side of it, and then say, let's do what the new experience is and time that and compare it. And if you use those in comparison, it helps connect people really quick. When they first say, I don't really know the whole workflow you're talking about, you have a visual. You look like literally a screen recording to highlight, this is what it feels like to the end user based off what they had before. Here's also the change and why this is so important. And they can actually see like, oh, this is so much faster. Well, this is obviously makes sense. Remember, we talked about those different boundaries. Business people can quickly understand why it's so important just based off productivity gains from speed, or someone may be able to see really quick from an operational standpoint how it's easier to install or run something. So that really helps articulate things pretty quickly without you having to explain all the lower level reasons why it may get them that. This is a quick way of doing that through storytelling of a user experience. It helps you stay well informed of what the user kind of actually is experiencing based off what you're building. Another kind of part of this I want to use to kind of wrap up on this talk was using things to anchor or reference to larger concepts. So we talk about abstractions. Often the things we bring up are abstractions of other ideas. And so it helps when you share an idea if you can connect to larger things that aren't just your opinion. That helps to say, adds maybe some weight to your points, but also says, is this actually that unique? Or is this really like a general understanding of how software development happens or works? And so what I liked about when you look through some of these, I'll reference as these kind of common laws and principles, is that these are like kind of well known. The more you use them or think about them, you start associating categories of problems to them. And it helps you kind of reason about systems a little bit better. And then it makes you think, should I use that in my communication? But like things we shared earlier, like acronyms, sharing the law itself could actually cause people to be confused. So when we go through some of these examples, you may, if I were to lead just with this law says this, Brook's law, people may, well, what does it actually mean? So you want to think about your decoder ring. You want to say, oh, like Brook's law, when, and then you can share something as part of that definition. It teaches people in that reference, and then maybe later you can use that kind of the acronym, the law reference to it. And it helps you, again, connect a problem you're experiencing to something larger, and it helps the audience to see that this isn't just unique to you. This is kind of a general understanding of the larger population. So one thing we'll start with this, was like the Law of Leaky Abstractions. And so Joel Spolsky has this one of all non-trivial abstractions to some degree are leaky. So you think about non-trivial, like kind of complex things. So at the beginning of the talk, remember we mentioned the cost of introducing abstraction. Sometimes you have these kind of more complicated topics, abstraction, things you share from like an API standpoint. You start actually having to expose some things about that API because you have to deal with a bunch of complexity underneath it. You may have to be dealing with a file system or remote system calls, and they may have to deal with exceptions from that. And so some of these details kind of leak back to the consumer, even though you're trying to abstract them from having to know that detail. So this is an important piece I even think about communicating ideas, is that those abstractions are generally leaky, especially when you get to very complex things. For you to even broach that subject, you're going to bring up the other things it's trying to abstract. Hyrum's law, I think, is another great reference of this, which kind of extends the leaky abstraction topic. So with like a sufficient number of users of an API, it doesn't matter what you promise or document on something. It's that the observable behaviors are really of the system that are dependent by somebody become actually the contract. So if you think about this one where we talked about some of the things that are leaking out or the side effects of this bucket that's supposed to be holding the water and abstracting us what it's containing, people are finding out the other behaviors of how that system is really working. There's a little bit of things leaking out, and that's what I'm actually leveraging. I expect it to do what it actually is undocumented. And so when you change that behavior, sometimes you break it. And so you'll find that sometimes when you teach people concepts or share them in an idea, and you have to explain some of the lower levels, and then you want to change those lower levels in the future, they already are kind of pinned to knowing those. And so you have to maybe reteach them again. And that's, again, that cost of kind of sharing abstractions, is that you don't want to get too many details that where you have to always re-explain it, because that can also cause more cost to a conversation. Gall's law, I think, is an important piece of this, of a law you can reference as a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that has worked. So meaning you would rarely find a complex system that was built from scratch. Normally it's built from a simple system that was working and has evolved from that point. So when you're getting into some of these systems or where you're describing things, you'll find that a complex system being built like from the ground up is highly complex. You're like, wait a minute, we should probably be starting with something, a much more simple idea, concept that you'd be sharing with someone before we iterate to anything higher to that. Because that's usually where everyone's going to be confused or no system will actually work as a result of it. So it's an important piece, I think, in just thinking about systems. It's a great law to reference when you see people kind of digging in quick and like, well, I think we're starting a little bit too much in the weeds here. We don't even have a working idea yet before we iterate and evolve that system. Brook's law, which I think is a one I cherish because I feel like people call this out in meetings often, is when adding human resources to a late software development project makes it later. And so this kind of came from the Mythical Man Month. So often I've heard people say Mythical Man Month when they're like in a meeting and they're behind. And so like, should we just add more people to the team? I'm like, well, we will actually get slower as a result of it. That concept of that adding resources to something that you think would just help accelerate it has a burden and cost to it. It's a great concept to bring up because it's not unique to you. But if you just were to say Brook's law in that conversation, someone's like, what are you talking about? Like, oh, Mythical Man Month is a book that was described by Frederick Brooks that goes into adding humans to an existing type software project will then normally make it later rather than faster because that's usually a common experience people have had. Hofstadter's law. It always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. So it's about us taking on complex systems. So you think about us being behind and adding people to it, usually because we aren't able to project things or estimate them well in complex systems. And this has kind of always been hard because in our technical systems, they're very complicated to actually make estimations. So be mindful that this one has always been a challenge in our software field, but if you were just to reference this as a reason why we're late on something because it's hard to actually predict, that might not be well received because one, they probably don't understand what Hofstadter's law may be if you reference it, but saying, look, this is a general challenge. We often find difficulties in doing any type of estimation in this amount of complexity. We should start in a more simple way first and iterate on what we understand now. We'll learn more as we go through it. And let's not try to do a 5-year estimation roadmap because we'll be way off. Let's start with a very small 30 to 90-day type window. Premature optimization effect. So this is Donald Knuth has this rate of premature optimization is the root of all evil. In this point, he kind of highlighted how we often focus on things that don't add much value because we think it's going to be a problem later. So we put a lot of effort in trying to put structure and understanding to it. And you need to be careful with that because it actually can be a very dangerous thing overall. So this isn't unique to you. And when you see it, you say, oh, premature optimization, that is a bad thing. Most people may, from this title, could probably understand premature optimization is not good. But just from the title, you don't know if it's good or bad. So it's probably good to remind people how it is a root of all evil from that definition of just the law itself. YAGNI is an example of this as well, where you say when you start building something, you find that you always want to implement just what you actually need. You really kind of embrace refactoring to make this work well over time. But you don't want to build a bunch of things you don't actually need yet. So you may hear people use YAGNI. Well, you ain't going to need it yet. That thought is that you have to be very mindful of the things you're going after. And so if people are asking to do something so you think we may need it in the future, you just say YAGNI, it may not resonate with everyone you're sharing with until you kind of explain why that's important and why that's generally a cost and why it was a big interest with extreme programming of minimizing what we're doing and focusing on what the value is first because we're going to use that to get more informed on our next steps. What I liked about all these is that there's a great inventory of places online where you can find more of these, but I love this Hacker Laws GitHub repository. It's a great kind of single listing of a lot of great references. So I encourage everyone to kind of get familiar with these and read up on them and use them in your conversations. But remember, you always have to decode some things first before you can start referencing these further in discussions and sharing them as part of your ideas. So as to end this, we're going to have kind of a summary. First, we want to focus on how you want to learn about your audience. We talked about boundary spanning and learning how getting experience in other kind of areas helps you build that understanding so you can communicate those effectively. The other one's just building your network so you can have a personal reference, someone you can test ideas with to get what they would care about, or even using them in your mind of what would Jill think if I said this because they have this perspective. It helps because it gives you a way of building how you want to communicate effectively to different groups. The architect elevator in this picture too highlights the importance of being able to communicate up and down, not just one way, and also the importance that there's a phone game that can happen between these levels that often has information loss, that kind of lossy data transmission. We also want to look at how we describe things through words. How can we use engaging words? Metaphors is an extremely powerful, magical element you can use, but they, of course, can have negative metaphor, like metaphors that actually hurt you, further require explaining, or bring on baggage you didn't want to use in explaining a topic. You can also use words that help build visuals in people's minds to help emphasize something that you actually want to make sure is realized versus generic or simple kind of descriptions about something. And remember to always be decoding things as you're going along for the first time because you can lose people pretty quick if you start using these kind of abbreviated terms, the codes that we had before, where you'll get some of that lossy data transmission. And then also using connected stories. So we talked about making sure you're talking about the meal, the thing of value. Don't just talk about specific technologies only. Talk about how they're being used together, their relationship. That's what people care about. You can always share the ingredients as people understand the meal. The relevant example helps bring a concrete thing up front so you think about that and can talk around it so you're not lost in just elements of abstraction. And last, using the user kind of as a story so they can help inform you better of impact. You can use that as part of visualization. When you tell something, you can actually show effects based off something you may think is very low level, you can maybe show important pieces of how it affects someone else, and that can then span across many different boundaries when you go through that type of understanding. And last, if you want to get these notes, you can get your own DevCon exclusive guide. And this guide has all these notes that we've already shared. And here's some of the references. I'll include more references with the guide too, but these are a couple of the key ones that I have shared in this talk. And thank you for joining me on this talk, and I hope you found this information helpful and learning the importance of why words matter, learning your audience, navigating kind of these technical topics, and being able to have hopefully a goal to get to more of that lossless data transmission of your idea from one person to the other. So thanks for joining.